So now we turn to chapter 8 of Mark, and we're nearing the close of this lengthy fourth donor council motif of Jesus that concludes the second episode. And wow, isn't it amazing how anti-mythological, anti-myth cultural Jesus is, his pattern is, compared with that of everyone around him. Jesus is perfectly non-mythological throughout here, inverting and subverting myth's pattern in Jesus' words and deeds and in his identity. And in Mark 8, verse 1, Jesus continues with another mass feeding, a feeding of a multitude of people. There was again a great multitude with nothing to eat, following Jesus. Jesus summons his disciples and says, as he did the last time, I feel compassion for the crowd because they've remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. In 8, verse 2. He worries aloud that if he sends them away, they'll faint on the way, in verse 3. And a scholar named Edwards remarks on both of the Jesus mass feedings, which notably occur within his fourth donor council motif, of course, consistent with our argument here, that this is Jesus' donor council motif, is these feedings of thousands of people, wonderful donation. Edwards writes, both these feedings emphasize Jesus' compassion on the crowds. The people have spent time with Jesus, listening to his good counsel, and now Jesus again seeks to donate towards their physical well-being as well. The Jesus donations are not for allies on the side of the hero. As seen in myth culture, mythological heroes only take care of people who support and submit themselves to them. That's the myth's way, but that's not Jesus. But Jesus' donations are for sinners whom he has come nevertheless to save, enemies of God that God is serving anyways. For people that the righteous of the myth culture would never help, too. You don't see concern for the people from the powers that be in Israel. As Edwards observes, in Mark, this word, splanchnizomai, compassion, is not used of people for whom one would naturally feel compassion, such as friends or compatriots, but for those far removed and even offensive or scandalous, such as lepers, revolutionaries, Gentiles, and demon-possessed people. Jesus' compassion is genuine and is for those that the world despises. It's amazing and shows God's great love. But based on location as well as other indicators, it also seems that the first mass feeding was of Israelites or Jews, while the second mass feeding is of Gentiles. And once again, Jesus' disciples express scandal and disbelief at the possibility of feeding so many people here in the wilderness, in Mark 8, verse 4. Jesus asks his disciples how many loaves of bread they have, and they say 7, in verse 5. Jesus decides to perform another miraculous donation. He directs the multitude to sit down, and just as before, he takes the loaves, gives thanks to the Father in heaven, breaks the loaves, and hands them to his disciples to serve the multitude, who do so, in verse 6. Jesus then does the same thing with a few small fish that they had in verse 7. Mark tells us that all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 baskets full of leftovers. About 4,000 men, presumably not including women and children, were fed by Jesus, and then he sent them away. Verses 8 to 9. Jesus immediately enters the boat with his disciples, and they sail to the district of Dalmanutha in Mark 8, verse 10. The Pharisees come out and begin arguing with Jesus, demanding a sign, a testing miracle from heaven to test him in verse 11. It's amazing that they ask for this at this point. How many miraculous signs have we seen? They're clearly continuously scandalized by Jesus' actions and words. Their demand is strange. As I said, he's given so many signs and confirmations of his identity and what he's doing and his message of the kingdom. Edwards notes Jesus is accosted by the Pharisees. Mark reads, came out as if in military rank. They not only question Jesus, but they dispute or oppose him. Likewise, the word for test, that they're testing Jesus, does not mean an objective test to discover the merit of something, but an obstacle or stumbling block, a scandal to discredit. They're attacking Jesus. Their inquiry is not in good faith, it's in bad faith. Jesus diffuses this by refusing to perform on demand for these leaders of Israel, who clearly have other motives for the demand than a desire to repent and believe in him. Jesus was sighing deeply in his spirit. The Greek term expresses utter dismay at these leaders of Israel, and he says to them, truly I say to you, no sign, no attesting miracle will be given to this generation, in verse 12. Jesus then gets back in the boat with his disciples and sails to the other side of the Galilee in verse 13, probably again creating social distance as a diffusive tactic. Edwards views this encounter between Jesus and the religio-political leaders of Israel as a low point for Jesus' ministry, and it does indeed occur near the end of the second scandal diffusion episode, at the height of scandal thus far. He writes, the Pharisees' intractable opposition and Jesus' utter dismay in the previous account marked a nadir, lowest point in the Galilean ministry. Mark tells us that the disciples had forgotten to bring bread with them and had but one loaf with them in the boat, verse 14. Meanwhile, Jesus is counseling them, giving orders that they watch out, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, in verse 15. Leaven symbolizes harboring unbelief while claiming to be a believer. Other examples in Luke 12 and 1 Corinthians 5 and Galatians 5. The disciples then begin to complain aloud about their lack of bread in 8 verse 16, and Jesus rebukes them, evidently for having in them the same leaven as the Pharisees and the Herodians, the leaders of Israel, and that they do not believe in Jesus, really, to be worried about that. And it seems their unbelief is at risk of leading to their scandal over Jesus as well, just like the Pharisees. Edwards notes, Jesus has not left the opposition behind with the Pharisees on the lake shore. It's with him in the boat. Jesus is moved to outright exasperation with his disciples. Like the prophet Ezekiel, Jesus is an exile among his own people. Son of man, you're living among a rebellious people. They have eyes to see, but do not see, and ears to hear, but do not hear. Ezekiel 12:2. Evidently, despite seeing what he has just been doing, Jesus' own core disciples still do not accept who he is and so what he can do. Jesus says, do you not yet see or understand? Do you yet have a hardened heart? In verse 17. And paraphrasing the prophet Ezekiel, Jesus says, having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? Jesus then asks the disciples whether they can remember what he has just done in his 2 mass feedings for the 5,000 Israelites and the 4,000 Gentiles, and how many leftovers there were in verses 19 to 20. It's a sort of reprimand that a parent gives to a child who keeps doing or saying the same thing after having been told so many times. They have to be treated like children, these disciples. And then Jesus says, do you not yet understand? In verse 21. Edwards calls Jesus' counsel here a fusillade of 7 questions combining pleading with censure. Pardon me. Jesus' own disciples, like the religio-political opposition, still do not realize who Jesus is, despite his many astonishing miraculous donations and counsels, confirming his identity and his gospel message of his coming kingdom of God, Israel. Amazing. Jesus arrives at Bethsaida with his disciples, and the people there bring him a blind man and plead for him to touch him in verse 22. Jesus decides to make another miraculous donation, taking the blind man by the hand, bringing him out of the village, and similarly to his miraculous healing of the deaf and mute man, Jesus touches his own saliva to the blind man's eyes in 8 verse 23, and Jesus asks, do you see anything? The blind man says essentially that he sees rather blurrily in verse 24. Jesus repeats the treatment, touching his eyes a second time, and made him look up. And then the blind man began to see everything clearly in verse 25. And Edwards remarks, we're immediately struck by Mark's emphasis on sight in the present miracle as opposed to the emphasis on blindness and lack of comprehension in the previous account. The juxtaposition of the 2 stories is a clue that the lingering blindness of the disciples may also be relieved by the continued touch of Jesus. The 2-stage cure in the present miracle thus suggests a process of revelation, as much for the disciples we suspect as for the blind man at Bethsaida. The ability to see, and I would say for Israel as a nation. Israel is not going to believe this time, but a day will come in the future when Israel will believe at Jesus' second coming. There's a prophetic element to this. The ability to see, both physically and spiritually, is a gift of God, not of human ability. His healing from failed sight to partial sight to complete sight comes solely from the repeated touch of Jesus. His healing exemplifies the situation of the disciples who move through the same 3 stages in Mark, from non-understanding to misunderstanding to complete understanding. Only at the cross and resurrection, especially above all the resurrection, will they, like the man at Bethsaida, see everything clearly. It appears that these three stages of understanding align with the three broad stages of the pattern that we are tracing here. The three passages Edward cites here fall within the first to second episodes, third to fourth episodes, fifth to sixth episodes of the pattern. After this donation of miraculous healing, Jesus sends the man to his home with counsel, saying, "Neither enter the village nor tell it to anyone in the village," in verse 26. Jesus is still practicing the diffusion of scandal here using privacy. This fourth donor counsel motif of Mark's gospel accounts by far the longest motif, as we've been experiencing here, of Jesus' unique divine pattern. In the pattern of myth culture laid out in combat myths, the donor counsel motif is quite brief and consists of the hero god receiving tools and counsel from other gods to defeat the villainous monster gods. Here in the gospel account, as we've been seeing, the donor counsel motif has Jesus in place of the hero, or villain, donating to and counseling sinners, everyone but himself, all the while they passively resist him and at times actively oppose him. So we can see the inversion and subversion so clearly here. The sin of the people of Israel and certain Gentiles that come up in the account here and there, as we've seen, and its effects are the monsters of the world. It's the sins of humanity that are the monsters. The source of villainy, true villainy. This sin nature frequently places the people at enmity with Jesus, yet he donates to and counsels them toward freedom from sin and death anyway. It's astonishing and completely different from our myth culture. Jesus graciously does this for the benefit of the monstrous, villainous, and weak of the world, for all humanity, both Jews and Gentiles, and all the while Jesus is opposed by the righteous and powerful of the world. Stein remarks on the two clear and opposing patterns of the gospel account in terms of the eventual cause of Jesus' death. The human cause of Jesus' death was due to the hostility of those who honored God with their lips, but whose heart was far from him. The divine cause for Jesus' death still awaits explanation, but this will come shortly. Stein clearly points to the pattern of myth culture in the sense of the opposition to Jesus, as well as the unique pattern of Jesus in terms of the divine plan. There are two things going on here, simultaneously and unhindered, both of them, but it completely opposed and different from one another. Eventually, Jesus will be opposed by everyone of the mythological world, as will be predicted in the third snare of striving deference episode, and it'll be seen in the fourth scapegoat deliverance episode, which we're coming to